Every summer, there's so much to look forward to. Here in Indiana, the unofficial start of summer is the Indy 500 on Memorial Day weekend. We go to the grocery store and it's time for the summer fruit. The cherries are back on the shelves. And in our professional field, we look forward to the new data from Giving USA. And that's what we're going to talk about today on this first day from the Fundraising School. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, joined today by my colleague, Christina Daniken. Christina is a senior leader of the research team at the Indiana University Lilly Family School Philanthropy, in which resides the Fundraising School. And Christina, what a delight to host you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me today, Bill. I'm actually really excited to share with you our new findings, hot off the press for Giving USA.
And as we record this, the Fundraising School trains in person in about a dozen U.S. cities, including New York. And so I'm in Manhattan as we record this. And just a few days ago, they had this big award ceremony, the Tony Awards, the Best of Broadway. And they come up with the envelope and they open up the envelope and they say, "What's in the envelope?" Christina, what's in the envelope this year for Giving USA?
Great question, Bill. So the biggest thing that I think everyone waits for is that big number as far as total giving for 2025. So let me just again reiterate that this year's publication is our Giving USA 2026. It's actually our 71st edition of Giving USA, but we are looking at giving in 2025 in that report. So for 2025, the big drum roll, total charitable giving grew to $617.2 billion in 2025. So that represents growth of 5% in current dollars, which is actually a new high in current dollars. Adjusted for inflation, we still are trailing 2021 a little bit, right? In the heat of the pandemic, that still leads when looking at inflation. But in 2025, total charitable giving surpassed $600 billion for the first time.
And just to make that distinction, when Christina talks about the highest amount in terms of current dollars, that's the value of the dollar in the year the dollar was donated. And, Christina, for me, that's always remarkable. And we see this new record in current dollars that there still is this persistent challenge with inflation, both the real number and what it means to people psychologically. This cloud of inflation that hangs over every single household. And yet, Americans still step forward with this record amount of charitable giving in terms of current dollars. If we can break it down, let's start with the sources, where the money came from. Later on, we can talk about the 9 subcategories where the money went to. But what did we see in terms of the sources in this year's report?
Sure, I'd be happy to look at those. So in Giving USA, we look at 4 different sources. We look at individual giving. We also look at bequest giving, which in many ways people think of as individual giving as well. But at the end of life, of course, we also look at giving by foundations and giving by corporations. So let's start with individuals. Growth in giving by individuals was up 4.1%, again in current dollars, for 2025. So the new total for 2025 giving by individuals was $394.2 billion.
Wonderful. And then what about the other sources?
Sure. Well, one of the things I just wanted to share is that in 2025, we had a really strong stock market performance by the end of the year, but there was a lot of variability, a lot of volatility throughout the year. If you remember, we went through all of that issue related to tariffs and tariff negotiations, and that caused a lot of hesitation, particularly with individual donors. So the stock market made certain donors very generous, but it also led to what we call historically low consumer sentiment. So there were some donors who were a little bit cautious, and that might have dampened some of the giving by individual donors. So like Bill, you were talking about the inflation, and also just concern about different jobs, things like that, that would have been a result of the tariffs. But overall, giving looked strong. Let's move to bequests. Bequests are actually one of the most interesting stories this year because we saw bequests grow by 19.7%. in 2025, again in current dollars. So the total for bequests was $62.19 billion. What's interesting is bequests have had growth of 20% in 3 of the last 4 years. So we're starting to see a bit of an upward trend there. And the other interesting aspect of bequests is that kind of in the medium term, if we look at growth in bequests over the 5 year period of 2021 to 2025, we see that giving by bequests actually outpaced total giving. So that shows that we're seeing some real growth there. Looking at some of the other sources, foundations actually grew in their giving by 5.7% in current dollars to a total of $117.15 billion. Again, back to that strong financial market performance in 2025, that had a lot to do with driving increased giving by foundations. And that wasn't really just for 2025. We've actually seen some strong stock markets for the last few years, which is continuing to strengthen and spur giving by foundations. One of the most interesting things, I think, about giving by foundations is that we've seen foundation giving at or above the $100 billion mark now for 4 years in a row since 2022. So I think that bodes well for increased giving by foundations. The other thing is just that foundations have been growing steadily and consistently over the past 15 years. So that's very promising. And finally, corporate giving. Corporate giving actually grew 3.1% in 2025 to a total of $43.67 or billion dollars, excuse me. Should I re-say that?
Just pause, give a 3, 2, 1, pause a little bit before you start talking again, and then Don can edit all of that out. So I would just say go back to when you're starting about the business sector because the rest was great.
Okay.
And even again, I would say you didn't even have to pause there. That was one of those normal
I just
bumps in the
forgot
road.
billion,
Yeah, that's
which
all
is
right.
kind of important.
You're good. You're
Okay.
doing great. Keep it up.
So I count down 3, 2, 1, Mark.
Hmm.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, Mark. Moving on to corporate giving. Corporate giving grew by 3.1% in current dollars to a total of $43.67 billion. What I think is interesting about corporate giving this year is that it actually grew this by the smallest amount of any of our sources that we look at in 2025. But when we look at growth over the past 5 years, so again, looking at giving between 2021 and 2025, we see that corporate giving has actually grown the most of any of our sources over that 5 year period. So there's no need for concern in terms of the more modest growth in corporate giving in 2025. So I do actually hear a lot of feedback when I'm out talking to nonprofits about corporate giving. And there are many nonprofits that are saying, it just doesn't feel like we're seeing as much growth in corporate giving as those numbers might indicate. And one of the things that I always just share with people is the fact that corporate giving is still strong. It's just shifting a little bit. So we're starting to see more strategic giving at those corporate foundation levels, at the highest levels, meaning that the corporations are doing more giving intentionally related to their missions or their markets. But at the local levels, which is where I think a lot of nonprofits are starting to feel that pinch, we have to understand that corporations are moving their local giving more into the hands of local employees and really growing things like employee matching programs, as well as local sponsorships and things like that.
Christine, I'm so glad you mentioned the 5 year average on the business sector. And I'm wondering if you also have that data for the headline total and for individuals and for foundations. I love these annual reports, but when I teach for the fundraising school, I like to look at that 5 year snapshot, that 10 year snapshot. And of course, 2020 and 2021 were unicorns. They were so unusual because of COVID and because of the double digit inflation rate and things like that that can really kind of skew an understanding long term. Can you give us a sense of, kind of maybe from 2019 onward, kind of before all of those differences happened, or at least in that 5-year window as you just did for the business sector, to just help us see kind of that, longer change over time?
Hmm. Sure, Bill. I don't have all of the specific numbers for the 5-year spans in front of me right at the moment, but I can tell you that, particularly with bequests, I know that growth in giving has been very strong over the past 2 5-year periods for bequest. So that carries us right through the pandemic and then into the most recent 5-year period, kind of as we moved out of the pandemic into 2025. Um, Again, looking at individual giving for this 5-year periods, we know that from 2021 to 2025, we saw some of the strongest growth in individual giving in history. I actually think that in 1996, so going way back, that was the leading 5-year period of growth. But we are still in some of the top 3 5-year periods in growth in individual giving from 2021 to 2025 as well.
Yeah, the regression line just points upward, whether we look at current dollars or inflation adjusted dollars. Always challenges. It's never easy, but there's a lot of good news in that 5-year trend as well. And Christina, is fundraisers use this for their planning. They go, well, this is the subsector I'm in. So what was the story in the arts, or what was the story in health or in education? What can you tell us about the recipients of these dollars in the 9 subsectors, the nonprofit sector that Giving USA measures?
Sure. So just to give a quick overview of the sectors that we do measure, we look at religion, human services, education, foundations, public society benefit, health, international affairs, arts, culture, and humanities, environment, and giving to individuals. So of all of those, the largest share of gifts actually went to religion, which is the same as it has been for the 40 years that we've been measuring giving to the various subsectors. However, giving to religion has grown very, very slowly in comparison to other subsectors, which means that it's each year accounting for a smaller and smaller share of the pie of total giving. So in 2025, religion actually accounted for 23% of the pie, down about a percent from last year, totaling $151.58 billion. But it did grow 2.4% in current dollars. But I think a more interesting story is looking at giving to human services. Because, Bill, you mentioned the pandemic and how things changed a lot during those years. One of those things that changed was an increase in giving to human services. So, for again, the past 40 years, human services usually came in third behind education. But starting in the pandemic, we started to see more significant growth to human services. And during the pandemic, human services actually overtook giving to education. And the interesting thing for 2025 is that for the first time, giving to human services actually accounts for 15% of total giving, which is the highest on record. And that total was $99.5 billion in 2025. And as we all know, giving to education is well and strong and accounts for 14% of total giving in 2025 for 92, a little over $92 billion. But I just wanted to point out a couple of kind of high level topics. So in 2025, we saw the most growth in education and then public society benefit. And I get a lot of questions. Sometimes people aren't really clear on what kinds of organizations fall into public society benefit. So, just to give you an idea, a lot of the broad community level development programs, um, different political events, economic development, even philanthropic organizations actually fall into public society benefit. But again, education, public society benefit, and the environment were the categories that grew the most, that saw the most increase in giving in 2025. But looking
You
at,
know,
I know, Bill, you're interested in kind of the long-term trends. So I just wanted to share that since 2005, so for 20 years, we've actually seen the most growth in human services, but also public society benefit and environment.
and I know in this report, in addition to the information you shared, health and the arts also reached inflation-adjusted highs in this most recent report, as well as the environment and animals, which again kind of follows that historic pattern when the economy struggles, as it was in that recession 5 years ago. Especially arts and environment take it the hardest, and then the pendulum swings back. And Christina, it looks like we've seen that in this year's report.
We did. And one area that I want to point out is so, again, in current dollars, we saw eight of our nine subsectors experiencing growth in giving. So that's a very positive sign. But the only subsector that we did not see growth in was actually giving to foundations. But I want to express that, again, kind of what you're talking about here. Giving to foundations is still very strong. It's actually, we're still seeing the level of giving to foundations at a higher level than we saw for the highs pre-pandemic in giving to foundations. But one of the things that I want to point out is that we actually saw an all-time high in giving to foundations in 2024. So it's not surprising that we see a bit of a downturn in giving to foundations in 2025, but it's just a bit of a downturn from that particular high that we saw.
And we hear so much when we teach for the fundraising school about donor advised funds. And I know, Christina, not all of the giving into donor advised funds is included in public society benefit, but a big chunk is. And again, this is just a hypothesis that as we saw that increase in public society benefit that you mentioned, that could be one of the signals of how we've gone from 1 million to 3 million DAFs in the United States, with much more money going into those giving vehicles.
Absolutely, Bill. So just to share with you kind of where those staff gifts really go and where they're counted in Giving USA, we do account for the giving to DAFs that are held by national sponsors into the public society benefit chapters. So that includes organizations such as Fidelity Charitable, DAF Giving 360, National Philanthropic Trust, those kinds of organizations. However, other sponsors of DAFs go elsewhere in Giving USA. So, for example, a lot of DAFs, a growing number of DAFs, are being hosted at community foundations. So, we account for those contributions in the foundations chapter. And then there are also standalone DAF sponsors that focus on a single issue. So, for example, some of our large universities in this country actually host their own DAFs,
Including ours.
including ours. So, because universities are educational institutions, obviously, we count contributions to those DAFs hosted by higher education organizations in our education category. And then the same thing, for example, like with religion, there are some standalone issue specific DAF sponsors that have DAFs just for that purpose. So we would count those under religion, just to give you an idea.
And as we assure our fundraising school participants every single year, really smart people like Christina and John Bergdahl and Shoshan Kuo, they do all they can to make sure DAFs are not double counted in terms of when they go in and then when they're released out to other 501(c)(3). So, Christina, thank you for walking us through that, since DAFs are always a hot topic in the courses that we teach. Okay, so thanks to our funders at the Giving Institute. I know that some of the resources are free and some can be purchased. Where can people go to get at least the executive summary of the report, or if they want to dive deeper with the wonderful book that you've written full of analysis?
Sure. So the full report can actually be found and purchased at the Giving USA Foundation website, which is givingusa.com. And then the infographic, which gives you a quick overview of the sources and the uses and those totals, can actually be found at the Lilly School of Philanthropy's website for Giving USA. And with the full report, I just wanted to mention that that is available both digitally as well as a full imprint copy on the Giving USA site.
Christina Daniken, lead researcher at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Thanks for sharing this good news, some flashing yellow lights, but information fundraisers can use to raise the support that they need to make the world a better place through their nonprofit organizations. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Bill, for having me.
And Giving USA is part of, I think, every single one of our courses, 24 in total, leading to 5 different certificates. As I mentioned earlier, we're in about a dozen U.S. cities now in person, and of course, online anywhere across the world, either recorded, meaning asynchronous, or virtual, meaning live. We can also customize training. We can bring a course just to you. We can design a course just for you. We have quarterly webinars and these weekly podcasts. Our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in its 5th edition. Where do you go? Online. go.iu.edu/TFRS for the fundraising school. I'm grateful for our producers today, Don Lorenz and Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.